My son and his wife tried to murder me for my inheritance. They thought I was just a frail old widow, an easy target they could poison with a simple cup of tea. For weeks, they kept me a prisoner in my own home, smiling to my face, while they plotted to steal everything my late husband and I had built together. But they made one critical mistake. They underestimated me, and they never imagined that I would be the one to orchestrate their complete and total ruin in front of everyone they knew, using the very fortune they tried to kill me for. The charity gala was exactly the kind of event my late husband Richard had loved, a glittering spectacle of wealth and influence, all for a good cause. From my place at the head table, I watched the sea of tuxedos and designer gowns, a symphony of clinking crystal and polite murmured gossip. I was wearing an emerald silk gown that Richard had bought me years ago, feeling a bit like a ghost at the feast. My son Grant and his wife Sloane were in their element. They were a golden couple, handsome and polished, moving through the room with an effortless grace that made me proud. They fluttered around me all evening, a constant, attentive presence. One moment, Grant was refilling my champagne flute. The next, Sloane was draping a cashmere wrap over my shoulders. It was a perfect performance of loving devotion, but something felt off. I saw the tightness around Grant's smile that wasn't there a few months ago, and I noticed how Sloane's eyes were never still. She wasn't enjoying the evening. She was scanning it, assessing everyone constantly performing. It was a subtle, discordant note in the flawless harmony of the night, a tension that coiled in my stomach. In the week that followed, their performance intensified into a full-blown production. Their visits to my home, the sprawling Greenwich estate Richard and I had built together, became more frequent, their concern more suffocating. Grant would gently take my phone from my hand, insisting I shouldn't be fielding calls from the brokers, that it was all too much stress for me. Sloane, with her bright, brittle smile, informed me she'd hired a new personal assistant to manage my schedule. They began intercepting my mail, screening my emails. When my dear neighbor Carol dropped by for our weekly cup of tea, Sloane met her at the door and politely explained that I was resting and couldn't have visitors. They were doing it all under the guise of protecting me, of cherishing me in my widowhood, but it didn't feel like protection. It felt like the walls of my own home were closing in, turning my sanctuary into a beautiful, inescapable cage. The final betrayal came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Grant arrived alone, carrying a heavy, leather-bound portfolio that looked terribly official. He sat beside me in the sunroom, his voice as smooth as silk as he explained that these were just some routine estate management documents. The accountants, he said, had recommended consolidating a few of the smaller trusts. It was all about tax efficiency, about protecting the family legacy for generations to come. It all sounded so reasonable, so responsible. He opened the folder to a page marked with a little yellow tab, pointing to a signature line. "Right here, Mom," he said. The page was a dense forest of legal jargon, but the heading seemed innocuous enough. I trusted my son. I took the heavy gold-plated pen he offered and signed my name. As he closed the folder, his smile was one of relief. But for a split second, I saw something else flash in his eyes. Not just relief, but a look of dark, absolute triumph. The look of a hunter who has just trapped his prey. That evening, a strange and creeping lethargy began to settle over me. I went to the kitchen to make my customary cup of chamomile tea, a ritual that had soothed me for years. As I poured the hot water, I noticed a faint, unusual aroma rising from the cup, something subtly floral and sweet, like Parma violets. I took a sip. A pleasant warmth spread through my limbs, but it was followed by a dizzying wave of weakness that made the room tilt. My heart began to flutter in my chest, like a trapped bird. I grabbed the edge of the marble countertop to steady myself, my mind growing foggy. And that's when I heard it. Grant's voice from the hallway, a harsh, panicked whisper into his phone. He wasn't speaking to me. He thought I was already asleep. He spoke of a transfer that didn't go through, of needing a full liquidation of my primary brokerage account now. The document I'd signed wasn't enough, he hissed. He said they had until Friday before a lawsuit was filed. Then came the words that stopped my heart cold. He asked if I was gone yet, his voice laced with a terrible urgency. The dosage, he said, should have been more than enough. My teacup slipped from my numb fingers, shattering on the floor. The world dissolved into a black, swirling void. But not before one last horrifying truth burned its way into my mind. The suffocating care, the signed document, the sweet-tasting tea, it wasn't about love. It was an execution. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. I woke up to the steady rhythmic beep of a heart monitor and the sterile antiseptic smell of a hospital. It had been 3 days since my world shattered on the kitchen floor. 3 days I didn't remember. The doctors were baffled. They called it a miracle, a sudden and severe cardiac event with no clear cause. They didn't know about the faint taste of violets in my tea. But I knew it wasn't a cardiac event. It was an execution that had failed. When Grant and Sloane finally appeared in the doorway, their faces were perfect masks of worried concern. But I saw it, a flicker of pure, unadulterated shock in their eyes. The shock of seeing a ghost. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. I played the part of the frail, confused survivor they expected to see. I told them it was all such a blur, my voice a raspy whisper. Back home, they installed a full-time nurse, a woman Sloane hired, of course. She was less of a caregiver and more of a warden. But even wardens take lunch breaks. That was my window. I used my tablet, my fingers trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from adrenaline, and I sent an email. It was to an old family friend, Jonathan Prescott, a man I knew sat on several boards with Grant. I kept it light and friendly, mentioning how good it was to see him at the gala. Then I planted the bomb. I told him I'd been speaking with Grant about a new tech fund he was excited about, one managed by a wunderkind named Alistair Finch. I said I was even thinking of moving some of Richard's portfolio into it, and I asked for his thoughts. That question was a torpedo aimed directly at the hull of their secret. I didn't know the whole story yet, but I knew that name had to be connected to the lawsuit Grant had mentioned. The effect was immediate. Less than an hour later, Grant was at my bedside, his face pale and clammy. He told me Jonathan had called him, his voice tight with panic, as he asked why on earth I was asking about that fund. He tried to explain it away as a highly speculative venture, not for me. Sloane rushed in moments later, her voice a little too bright, a little too cheerful, saying they were going to tell me about it. They had looked into it. She chirped and decided against it because it was far too risky. Their stories were a frantic, clumsy patchwork of lies bumping into each other, contradicting each other. They were amateurs, and their panic was making them sloppy. It confirmed their guilt more effectively than any confession could have. That night, long after the nurse had made her final rounds, I waited for the house to fall silent. Then I made a call. I dialed a number I knew by heart, but hadn't used in over a year. A man's voice answered on the second ring. I just said his name, Arthur. It was all I needed to say. Arthur Vance wasn't just my late husband's estate lawyer. He was his closest confidant, a man as sharp and ruthless as a hawk. In a low, urgent whisper, I told him everything. The isolation, the document, the tea, the overheard conversation. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was as cold as ice. He told me he was booking the first flight to Greenwich. He gave me my orders. Do not drink the tea. Do not sign anything. You are no longer alone. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house had changed. The air, which had been merely oppressive, was now thick with danger. Grant informed me that the doctors had ordered absolute rest. No calls, no emails, no visitors. Sloane then came into my room with a sad little smile and gently took my tablet and my phone. She said they would handle everything, so I could just focus on healing. They were cutting me off from the world completely. As Sloane pulled the heavy curtains closed, plunging the room into a dim twilight, I didn't feel a shred of fear. I felt a cold, hard resolve crystallizing in my veins. They thought they were burying a victim. They didn't realize they were planting a seed. I leaned into the role of the helpless invalid with the dedication of a stage actor. My memory became spotty, my moments of lucidity brief and confused. I allowed Sloane to spoon-feed me lukewarm broth, her expression a careful mix of pity and impatience. I let the nurse check my vitals every hour, offering a weak, grateful smile each time. I would nod placidly when Grant sat by my bed and explained in a slow, patronizing tone how he was temporarily managing my finances to ease my burden. My performance was so convincing that I could see the tension drain out of them day by day. Their panic over my email to Jonathan faded, replaced by a returning arrogance. They were convinced it had been a random medicated musing from a mind already beginning to fail. The danger had passed, they thought. They no longer saw a person when they looked at me. They saw a living vault, and they believed they were just one small step away from finding the final combination. I didn't know the full extent of their desperation then, of course. I would only learn the details later, after Arthur's investigators had pieced it all together. But I can picture it now. While I was pretending to sleep, they were sitting in a sleek, glass-walled office in Stamford, their own gilded world collapsing around them. They were facing two stone-faced lawyers, representing a group of their own friends, the very people they had convinced to invest in Alistair Finch's fund. The lawyers told them the extension was denied. Their investors were proceeding with a fraud suit. They had 72 hours to return $18 million. If they failed, the charges would be filed and a press release would be sent to every major financial news outlet in the tri-state area. Their careers, their reputations, their entire lives in a town that worshipped success would be incinerated. I can just hear Sloane's composure cracking, her voice shrill with panic, as she insisted they could get the money, that my estate was worth more than double that they just needed a little more time. The lawyers were unmoved. The clock was ticking, and their self-made coffin was being nailed shut. Back in my quiet, sunlit bedroom, I was anything but idle. Arthur had arranged for a special delivery, a lavish bouquet of orchids. Hidden deep within the foliage was a small, tissue-wrapped package. Inside was a secure, encrypted laptop. During the nurse's breaks, while I was supposed to be napping, I was working. I wasn't just resting, I was studying. Arthur had given me access to Richard's private server, a digital fortress, where he kept his real ledgers. I spent hours following the intricate threads of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and interlocking LLCs. It was the complex financial armor my husband had built around our fortune, and I discovered I understood its design better than I ever imagined. And then I founded a dormant holding company, an entity with a name that meant nothing to anyone but me and Richard, with a line of credit substantial enough to be a weapon. I wasn't just preparing a defense, I was preparing for war. Their downfall came, as it so often does, from their own hubris. Believing me to be completely incapacitated and clueless, they grew careless. One afternoon, Grant stood in the hallway just outside my bedroom door, which I'd made sure was left slightly ajar. He was on the phone with Sloane, his voice a hushed, angry whisper that carried perfectly in the still house. He was telling her how I was just sitting in there completely unaware. He said in another few days his lawyer would have the new power of attorney finalized, citing my diminished capacity. They would have full control then. He was confident it would work. Once they had the money, he promised her they could make the investors whole and no one would ever know. What he didn't realize was that I was on the other side of that door, sharp and lucid, listening to every single word. And he didn't know that my old tablet, the one Sloane had taken from me, but left on my nightstand, was silently recording his entire self-incriminating confession. They had underestimated the Queen, and in doing so had walked right into my checkmate. The doorbell rang at precisely 10 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't the gentle chime of a friendly visitor. It was a sharp, authoritative sound that sliced through the funereal quiet of the house. From my armchair in the living room, where I was pretending to read, I heard Sloane's light footsteps, then the heavy oak door swinging open. There was a pause, a dead silence. I knew without seeing him that Arthur Vance had arrived. Grant rushed into the foyer, his voice a low, furious growl. He was telling the visitor that his mother wasn't seeing anyone, that she was unwell. But Arthur's voice, calm and cold as a winter river, cut right through him. He announced that he was here to see his client, Rachel. I heard the rustle of paper, and Arthur explaining that according to the emergency injunction he held, he was not only permitted to see me, but was also granted temporary oversight of all my assets, pending a full capacity hearing. The final words hung in the air like a death sentence. He had reason to believe I had been the victim of elder abuse and financial fraud. The siege was over. My rescuer had breached the walls. The great confrontation didn't happen in a sterile office. It happened in my formal living room, the one with the high ceilings, and the portrait of Richard over the fireplace, a room I had always reserved for the most special of occasions. I was seated in my favorite wingback chair, no longer slumped in feigned weakness, but sitting straight and composed. Arthur stood beside me, a pillar of strength, while his two young imposing associates stood silently by the doors like sentinels. Grant and Sloane were forced to sit on the sofa opposite me, looking like cornered animals. Arthur began, his voice methodical, laying out the case with the surgical precision of a master prosecutor. He presented bank records that showed Grant's repeated failed attempts to access my primary accounts. He mentioned the power of attorney document I had been tricked into signing, informing them it had already been legally nullified. Then he delivered the killing blow. He took out my tablet, the one Sloane had so carelessly left on my nightstand, and pressed play. Grant's own voice filled the silent room, a harsh, greedy whisper from the recording. We all heard him promise Sloane that once they had the money, they could make the investors whole and no one would ever know. The color drained from my son's face, leaving it a pasty, sickly gray. But it was Sloane who shattered. A raw, guttural sob ripped from her throat, a sound of pure agony that signaled the complete destruction of her perfect, polished facade. Her words came out in a torrent, a chaotic, shrieking confession of blame and terror. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she cried. He had told her it was a sure thing. All their money was gone. Their friends' money was gone. They were going to be sued, ruined, lose everything. It was his idea, she screamed, pointing a trembling, accusing finger at my son, her face a mess of tears and smeared mascara. The carefully constructed partnership of their conspiracy fractured right there in front of me, devolving into a desperate, ugly firestorm of accusation as they turned on each other, spitting blame and venom. I let them tear each other apart for a full minute before I finally spoke. My voice wasn't loud, but it resonated with an authority that silenced the room instantly. Enough. I looked at my son, and what I felt in that moment wasn't hatred, but a profound, chilling disappointment that was somehow worse. I told him that he didn't just try to steal my money, he tried to steal the rest of my life. He tried to erase his father's legacy with his greed and his weakness. Then I stood up, feeling my own strength return to my limbs, my posture straight and strong. I was no longer the victim in this story. I was the judge. I informed them that Arthur would escort them out, that they were never to return to this house, and that they would have no further contact with me. But I wasn't finished. I told them a board meeting for the family foundation was scheduled for Friday, and that their attendance was mandatory. Their public life, I said, wasn't over yet. I had one final lesson to teach them. They just stared, their faces stripped bare of all their lies and arrogance, replaced now with the dawning, terrifying realization that this was not the end of their nightmare. It was just the beginning of their public reckoning. The annual board meeting of the Maxwell Family Foundation was always the pinnacle of the Greenwich philanthropic scene, but this year it was something more. Held in the grand ballroom of the country club, the room was a sea of familiar faces. The town's most influential figures, the titans of industry and their elegant wives, the men and women whose whispered opinions could build an empire or shatter a reputation. This was the stage I had chosen for my final act. Grant and Sloane arrived looking like ghosts at a banquet. They were pale and haunted, their eyes hollow. Their presence was mandatory, a condition of the bail that I, through Arthur, had anonymously posted. They couldn't run and they couldn't hide. They tried to project an air of normalcy, a faint echo of their former confidence, but the whispers followed them like a chill wind, heads turning and conversations ceasing as they passed. And then I made my entrance. They were all expecting a frail, heartbroken widow. Instead, they saw a queen. I was dressed in a striking crimson gown, a color of power and vitality. My posture was straight, my head held high. On my arm was Arthur Vance, his grim expression a warning to all. And walking just behind us was Jonathan Prescott, his face set with a quiet, resolute anger. The murmurs in the room changed from gossip to stunned silence. When the meeting was called to order, I did not wait to be introduced. I walked directly to the podium, the single microphone amplifying the sound of my calm, steady breathing. I let my eyes scan the crowd, acknowledging old friends with a slight nod, before finally letting my gaze land on my son. I began to speak. I thanked them all for coming. I spoke of my late husband, Richard, and how for years this foundation had been a symbol of his integrity and his vision for a better community. But today, I told them it would become a symbol of something even more important: truth. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. My voice never wavered. I simply methodically laid out the facts. I told them a story about a fraudulent investment scheme, one that had quietly devastated several families in our very own community. I spoke of trust betrayed and futures stolen. Then I nodded to Jonathan. He stood up, his presence commanding the room's full attention, and he corroborated my story. He named the man Alistair Finch, and he named the fund that had ruined him and so many others. A wave of uneasy recognition passed through the room. Then I turned my eyes back to my son and his wife. And I told the room that some victims, in their terrible desperation, chose to victimize others. The judgment was not delivered by a gavel or a judge. It was delivered in a swift, silent rush by 100 pairs of eyes turning as one towards Grant and Sloane. A collective, audible gasp sucked the air from the room, followed by a wave of shocked, disgusted murmurs. That was the real punishment. Not a prison cell, but the complete and utter annihilation of their social standing, the very thing for which they had been willing to kill me. Their identities were erased in that moment. But I wasn't done. I presented my evidence. On the large screen behind me, I projected an image of the fraudulent document Grant had tricked me into signing. Then the toxicology report from the hospital, the clinical, undeniable proof of a rare alkaloid poison in my system. Finally, a series of bank records showing Grant's frantic, desperate attempts to liquidate my assets in the hours after he thought I was dead. The room was so silent, you could hear a pin drop the weight of their crimes, settling over the assembly like a shroud. Then I delivered my final lesson. My voice rang with purpose as I made my first announcement effective immediately. I was dissolving the Maxwell Family Foundation in its current form. A wave of shock rippled through the stunned audience. But before they could process it, I continued. In its place, I was launching a new initiative, the Maxwell Legacy Fund. I told them its initial endowment would be $43 million, and its sole mission would be to provide legal support and financial restitution for the victims of financial fraud. I had taken the inheritance they tried to kill me for and turned it into their public penance, a permanent monument to their greed and my survival. Then came the final devastating blow. I informed the board that all of our findings, including the toxicology report and the evidence of attempted murder, had been turned over to the Greenwich Police Department. As if on cue, 2 uniformed officers entered the ballroom from a side door. They didn't rush. They walked calmly, purposefully through the silent, parted crowd, their path leading directly to Grant and Sloane's table. The reckoning was complete. The storm, when it broke, was surprisingly quiet. There were no more shouting matches or dramatic confrontations, just the rustle of newspapers and the endless, merciless churn of the Greenwich rumor mill. The events at the country club became the scandal of the season. Grant and Sloane's faces were splashed across the front pages of the local papers, their perfect lives dissected in breathless, gossipy detail. They had feared a social death, and that is exactly what they got. It was swift and absolute. They were ostracized overnight, their names magically erased from guest lists, their calls left unanswered. The cruelest cut of all came from their own friends, the very people they had duped into the investment scheme. Once the truth was out, those friends became the most vocal and damning witnesses for the prosecution, eager to distance themselves from the failure and the shame. In the months that followed, as the legal proceedings ground on their paths, diverged completely. Sloane, faced with an ironclad case and the ruin of her life, chose self-preservation. She took a plea deal, turning state's evidence against her own husband. I read the transcripts of her testimony, where she painted herself as a coerced and terrified pawn in Grant's desperate scheme. It was a masterful performance, and it worked. Her sentence was significantly reduced, but she was left with nothing: no money, no husband, no social standing. The last I heard, she had legally changed her name and disappeared, moving to some small, anonymous town in the Midwest to live a quiet life, defined by the shame she could never outrun. Grant, however, remained defiant to the very end. He refused any admission of guilt, any flicker of remorse. He maintained his innocence, blaming everyone but himself. He blamed Sloane for her weakness, the market for its volatility, and even me, his mother, for not simply giving him the money when he needed it. He was convicted on all counts, including attempted murder and fraud, and was sentenced to a long prison term. The arrogance he had worn like a tailored suit simply hardened into a permanent, bitter mask. While their worlds crumbled, mine was rebuilt stronger and more beautiful than before. The Maxwell Legacy Fund became my life's new purpose. I was no longer just a widow managing an estate. I was an active, engaged philanthropist, a force for justice in my own community. I didn't just write checks from an office. I made a point to personally meet with many of the victims my fund supported. I would sit with them, share my own story of betrayal, and offer not just financial help, but the kind of wisdom and empathy that only comes from walking through the fire yourself. I reconnected with old friends I had been isolated from. I started traveling again, and my beautiful home was no longer a place of oppressive silence. It was filled with the laughter and conversation of people who genuinely loved and respected me. The gilded cage had finally become a true sanctuary once more. The final scene of this long, painful chapter of my life took place a year later. I was sitting on the sun-drenched terrace of my home, overlooking the vibrant, blooming gardens that my housekeeper Maria and I had so lovingly tended. The air was warm, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the great oak tree my Richard had planted decades ago. I was reading a letter. It was from a young woman, a single mother who had lost her entire life savings to an online scam. She wrote that thanks to the fund's help, she was able to keep her home and that her son, a bright young man, had just been accepted to college. A small, genuine smile touched my lips. I had faced the deepest, most unimaginable betrayal, and I had not only survived, but I had managed to transform my pain into a powerful legacy of hope and resilience. I set the letter down and picked up my teacup. It was just a simple, fragrant chamomile, warm and untainted. I took a sip and looked out at the world I had reclaimed, a world that was truly finally mine. I was at peace, a queen in my own right, strong and independent, the sole, undisputed guardian of my husband's honor and my own precious, hard-won life. Rachel's story teaches a difficult but powerful lesson about betrayal and resilience. It shows how even the deepest love can be twisted by overwhelming fear and shame, leading good people to make monstrous choices. But her journey proves that survival is only the first step. True strength is found not in the act of revenge, but in the choice to transform profound pain into a greater purpose. Her ultimate victory wasn't just in exposing a terrible wrong, but in building a new legacy of hope from the ashes of her old life.